Just after midnight on August 8, 1973, a police dispatcher in Pasadena, Texas, took a call from a 17-year-old boy who told her, in a voice she would later describe as unnervingly calm, that he had just killed a man and that officers needed to come to a specific address right away. When patrol units arrived at the house on Lamar Drive, they found the boy, Wayne Henley, sitting on the front porch, waiting for them, having made no attempt whatsoever to flee the scene or dispose of any evidence in the time between the shooting and their arrival. Inside the house, in the hallway, lay the body of a 33-year-old man named Dean Corll, shot 6 times. Henley told the officers everything, speaking with the same strange, matter-of-fact composure that had brought them to the scene in the first place. A composure that several of the responding officers later described as deeply unsettling given the scale of what he was describing. He explained that Corll had been his friend, his employer, and for the past several years, the architect of an arrangement between the two of them that had resulted in the deaths of dozens of teenage boys across the Houston area. Boys that Henley himself, along with another young accomplice named David Brooks, had helped Corll lure, restrain, and ultimately kill. He told the officers where the bodies were buried. He offered to take them there personally, and in the hours that followed, he did exactly that, riding in a patrol car to a rented boat storage facility on Silver Bell Street in southwest Houston, and directing officers to begin digging. What the police found over the following days, digging through the packed dirt floor of a rented boat storage shed in southwest Houston, would become one of the largest and most horrifying crime scenes in American history up to that point. 17 bodies buried beneath a single structure, wrapped in plastic, encased in lime, stacked in places nearly on top of one another in a space no larger than a modest 2-car garage. Additional bodies would be recovered in the weeks that followed from a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula and from the wooded shoreline of Lake Sam Rayburn, bringing the eventual total number of confirmed victims to at least 28 young men and teenage boys murdered over a period of approximately 3 years by a man whose neighbors in the Houston Heights had known him, affectionately, as the Candyman. Dean Arnold Corll worked for years at his family's candy company, and as a young man in his 20s and 30s living in a working-class Houston neighborhood filled with children, he had developed a reputation as an unusually generous and likable figure, someone who handed out free candy to the neighborhood kids, who let them hang around his apartment to listen to music and drink sodas, who seemed, to the parents of the Heights, like exactly the kind of harmless, friendly adult presence that made a neighborhood feel safe. He was, in fact, one of the most prolific child killers in the recorded history of the United States. And the reason his crimes continued undetected for as long as they did was not merely his own careful concealment, but a specific and devastating failure on the part of Houston law enforcement to take seriously years of reports regarding missing teenage boys from a working-class neighborhood, whose families, in case after case, were told that their sons had simply run away. To understand how Dean Corll built both his public reputation and his secret operation, and how 2 teenage boys became active participants in his crimes rather than simply his victims, we have to go back to his own childhood, to a specific series of personal and professional setbacks that preceded his first murder, and to the particular social dynamics of a Houston neighborhood where an entire community's trust was systematically exploited over the course of nearly 3 years. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Arnold Edwin Corll and Mary Emmeline West. His parents' marriage was troubled from early on, marked by his father's volatile temper and a pattern of separation and reconciliation that repeated itself several times throughout Corll's childhood, and the family relocated multiple times as a direct result of this instability, moving between Indiana and Texas on more than one occasion as his parents' relationship deteriorated and briefly mended before deteriorating again. This pattern of geographic and domestic instability meant that Corll spent much of his childhood adjusting to new schools, new towns, and new configurations of his own family. Without the kind of consistent home environment that might have provided a stabilizing influence during his formative years. His mother eventually divorced his father and remarried, and the newly blended family relocated permanently to Texas, settling first in Vidor, a small town in the southeastern part of the state, and eventually in the Houston area, where Mary would go on to build a candy manufacturing business, Pecan Prince Candy Company, later renamed Corll Candy Company. A business that would come to define much of Dean's adult life and would, eventually, provide him with both a plausible cover story and a genuinely effective tool for building relationships with the neighborhood children who would eventually become his victims. Mary Corll has been described by those who knew the family during this period as a domineering presence in her son's life, closely involved in both the family business and, according to several accounts given after the case became public, in her adult son's personal life and living arrangements well into his 20s and 30s, a level of maternal involvement that several of the psychologists who later studied the case considered relevant, though not conclusively explanatory, to understanding the specific developmental context from which Corll's adult behavior eventually emerged. As a young man, Corll worked in the family candy business, eventually taking a more central role in its daily operations, a job that placed him, quite literally, in the business of giving children treats. An occupation that dovetailed disturbingly well with the specific pattern of behavior he would begin to develop as an adult. Friends and acquaintances from this period of his life described him as quiet, somewhat awkward in social situations, particularly with adult women, and notably more comfortable and at ease spending time with much younger people, children and early teenagers. A preference that, in the specific cultural context of a Houston neighborhood in the late 1960s and early 1970s, drew remarkably little scrutiny or suspicion, understood by most adults around him as simply an eccentric, if slightly unusual, personality trait rather than anything more troubling. He was remembered by several former acquaintances as someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of children in a way that read, at the time, as innocent enthusiasm rather than anything predatory, a misreading that would later come to seem, in retrospect, one of the case's most painful ironies. Corll briefly served in the United States Army in the early 1960s, receiving a hardship discharge after a relatively short period of service related to family obligations connected to the candy business, and he returned to Houston to resume his role in the family company. The candy factory itself, located in the Houston Heights neighborhood, became something of an informal gathering place for local children over the following years, with Corll handing out free samples and candy to kids who would stop by, building, over time, a genuine and widespread reputation throughout the neighborhood as a friendly, generous adult, someone whose house and later apartment became, for a certain segment of the neighborhood's children and teenagers, an informal hangout spot where they could listen to music, drink sodas, and spend time away from their own homes. This carefully cultivated reputation, built gradually and genuinely over years of consistent, generous behavior toward the neighborhood's children, would eventually become the single most important tool in Corll's ability to identify, approach, and gain the trust of the boys who would become his victims. A reputation so thoroughly established that even after his crimes were finally exposed, several Heights residents expressed genuine, stunned disbelief, unable to reconcile the friendly candy man they had known with the killer whose activities investigators were describing. Parents in the neighborhood, interviewed years later, recalled having no particular concern about their son spending time at Corll's apartment. viewing him as simply another adult presence in a tight-knit, working-class community where children moved relatively freely between different households and informal gathering spots, a level of casual, unquestioned trust that Corll appears to have cultivated with a patience and consistency that, in retrospect, suggests a level of premeditation extending back years before his first confirmed murder. The specific mechanics of how Corll built this trust were, in their outward form, almost entirely unremarkable, small kindnesses repeated consistently over time, a willingness to let teenagers use his car, buy them alcohol despite their being under the legal drinking age, and generally serve as a more permissive and less judgmental adult presence than many of the boys experienced within their own households, a dynamic that several criminologists who have studied the case have identified as a textbook, if particularly extended and patient. Example of the specific grooming behaviors that predatory adults use to gain access to and control over younger victims. Behaviors that, precisely because they read as ordinary generosity rather than anything more calculated, are especially difficult for outside observers, including parents, to recognize as warning signs until it is far too late. The candy company eventually closed in the late 1960s, a business failure that coincided with a period of significant personal instability in Corll's life, including the end of a brief and unsuccessful marriage, and it was during this period, according to the timeline eventually established by investigators and through the confessions of his surviving accomplices, that Corll's pattern of violence against teenage boys began in earnest, beginning around 1970 and continuing with escalating frequency over the following 3 years. Corll did not act alone in the commission of his crimes, a fact that distinguishes his case from nearly every other individual serial killer covered across this series, and that adds a specific and deeply disturbing dimension to the overall horror of what occurred in Houston during this period. Beginning in the early 1970s, Corll cultivated a relationship with a teenage boy named David Owen Brooks, who had first met Corll as a young child through the candy business, riding his bicycle to the factory to collect free samples along with dozens of other neighborhood kids, and who, by his mid-teens, had developed a relationship with the older man that involved both genuine friendship and, eventually, direct participation in Corll's crimes. Brooks, according to his own later testimony and confession, was initially paid money by Corll in exchange for bringing other boys to him, a role that gradually expanded from simple recruitment into direct participation in the murders themselves, a progression that occurred, according to the timeline Brooks himself later provided, gradually enough that he was able to rationalize each individual step as somehow separate and distinct from the ones that preceded it, a pattern of psychological accommodation to escalating violence that researchers studying the case have found relevant to understanding how ordinary teenage boys became active participants in atrocity. In 1971, Corll's circle expanded to include a second teenage accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., a boy from the same Heights neighborhood who had also known Corll for years and who, like Brooks, was initially brought into the operation through a combination of genuine friendship, financial incentive, and, according to both Brooks's and Henley's later accounts, a specific and calculated manipulation on Corll's part that gradually normalized their participation in increasingly serious acts of violence, beginning with relatively minor tasks and escalating, over time, to direct involvement in abduction, restraint, and eventually murder. Henley was reportedly paid a set amount of money, a figure that varied across different accounts given over the years, but that several sources place at approximately $200 for each boy he successfully brought to Corll, a specific and transactional arrangement that Henley himself would later describe with a discomfort that suggested at least some retrospective recognition of what that arrangement had actually required of him. The specific psychological dynamics that led two teenage boys to become active participants in the murder of their own peers rather than victims themselves, has remained a subject of extensive study and debate among criminologists and psychologists in the decades since the case was first exposed. Both Brooks and Henley would later testify that they had, at various points, feared for their own lives if they refused to participate or attempted to expose what Corll was doing, describing specific instances in which Corll had threatened them directly, brandishing weapons or making explicit statements about what would happen to them if they ever spoke to anyone about what they had witnessed. This claim, that their participation was substantially coerced through genuine fear for their own safety, was treated with considerable skepticism by prosecutors and by several of the investigators who worked the case most closely, given the extensive and voluntary nature of their participation across dozens of individual murders over multiple years. Participation that included, in Henley's case specifically, direct recruitment of numerous victims from among his own friends and acquaintances, boys who trusted him precisely because he was their peer and who had no reason to suspect that an invitation from Henley carried any danger whatsoever. The method that Corll, Brooks, and Henley developed and refined over the following 3 years followed a broadly consistent pattern, though with variations across individual cases. Victims were typically recruited through Henley or Brooks, often boys they knew personally from the neighborhood or from school. Lured to Corll's residence, at various points a series of different rented houses and apartments across the Houston area, under various pretexts, invitations to parties, promises of drugs or alcohol, or simply the ordinary social invitation of hanging out with older acquaintances. Corll relocated residences multiple times over the 3-year span of the killings, a pattern that investigators later understood as at least partially deliberate, allowing him to avoid the kind of prolonged familiarity with any single set of neighbors that might eventually have generated the sort of suspicion his years of carefully cultivated goodwill in the Heights neighborhood had otherwise successfully prevented. Once at the residence, victims were restrained, in many documented cases using a specific method involving handcuffs and a plywood board that Corll had specifically constructed for this purpose, a device investigators recovered and later described in court as evidence of extensive premeditation rather than any spontaneous or impulsive act of violence. Victims were subjected to prolonged torture and sexual assault before eventually being killed, most commonly through strangulation or shooting, a sequence of events that both Brooks and Henley described to investigators in painstaking and, according to several of the detectives present for these interviews, deeply disturbing detail during the extensive debriefing sessions that followed their arrests, sessions that produced the specific information ultimately needed to locate and recover the majority of the victims' remains. The specific and sustained nature of this pattern, repeated across dozens of individual victims over a period of nearly 3 years, required a level of planning, concealment, and psychological compartmentalization that several of the criminologists who have studied the case have identified as broadly consistent with patterns documented in other cases of prolonged, methodical serial murder. Though the specific involvement of 2 teenage co-conspirators, actively participating across the full multi-year span of the operation rather than serving as one-time or occasional accomplices, remains, even decades later, one of the most singular and difficult to categorize aspects of the entire case within the broader history of American serial crime. The sheer duration and organized nature of this operation, extending across nearly 3 years and eventually claiming at least 28 confirmed lives, occurred within a specific social and institutional context that made its continuation possible for far longer than it might otherwise have been. The Houston Heights neighborhood where Corll operated was, during this period, a working-class community, and a significant number of his victims came from families with limited resources and, in several cases, limited social standing to press for sustained police attention when their sons went missing. Family after family reported a missing teenage son to Houston police during this period, only to be told, in case after documented case, that the boy had most likely simply run away. A characterization that reflected broader cultural assumptions of the era regarding teenage runaways, and that resulted in a systematic failure to connect what were, in fact, dozens of related disappearances occurring within the same relatively contained geographic area over a relatively contained period of time. Several parents, in accounts given years later, once the true scope of what had happened became public, described specific and painful interactions with police officers who dismissed their concerns almost immediately, suggesting that their sons had likely left home due to family conflict, drug involvement, or simple teenage restlessness. Explanations that, whatever their statistical plausibility in isolation, took on a far more troubling character once it became clear how many families across the same small geographic area were being offered nearly identical explanations for nearly simultaneous disappearances. The Houston Police Department, during this period, maintained no systematic mechanism for cross-referencing missing persons reports by neighborhood, age range, or any other pattern-based criteria that might have flagged the accumulating disappearances as something requiring coordinated investigation, rather than a series of unconnected, individually unremarkable cases. This pattern of institutional dismissal, strikingly similar to the systemic failures examined in previous episodes of this series covering cases like the Green River killings, meant that Corll, Brooks, and Henley were able to continue their operation for years without ever triggering the kind of coordinated, cross-referenced investigation that might have connected the disappearances and identified a common thread far sooner than eventually occurred. Parents who filed missing persons reports described, in interviews conducted years later after the full scope of the case became known, a specific and painful frustration with police officers who seemed uninterested in pursuing their sons' disappearances with any real urgency, treating each case as an isolated, unremarkable instance of teenage rebellion rather than as a potential piece of a much larger and more horrifying pattern. In at least one documented instance, a mother who had reported her son missing was told directly by an investigating officer that boys from the Heights neighborhood ran away from home often enough that the department simply did not have the resources to pursue every such case with the same urgency that a different kind of disappearance from a different kind of neighborhood might have received, an admission that, however candidly offered at the time, stands as one of the most explicit acknowledgments of exactly the kind of class-based institutional bias that allowed this specific case to continue for as long as it did. Throughout 1970, 1971, and 1972, the disappearances continued at a steady and, in retrospect, deeply alarming pace, though at the time, given the fragmented nature of missing persons reporting across different Houston area jurisdictions and the general dismissiveness with which many of these cases were treated, no single investigator or department had assembled anything approaching a complete picture of what was actually occurring. Boys disappeared from their homes, from street corners, from parties, each case handled individually, each family left to search largely on their own, with little institutional support or sustained investigative attention, while the actual perpetrators continued operating within the same small geographic area, in some cases recruiting subsequent victims from among the friends and acquaintances of boys who had already been killed. The operation finally collapsed, not through any conventional investigative breakthrough, but through an internal conflict among the three men themselves that erupted into violence on the night of August 7, 1973. Wayne Henley, then 17 years old, had invited two acquaintances, a young man named Timothy Curley and a young woman named Rhonda Williams, to a gathering at Corll's residence that evening. An invitation that immediately angered Corll, who had specific and controlling expectations regarding who Henley was permitted to bring to these gatherings, and who reacted to Rhonda Williams's presence, according to Henley's later account, with a level of fury that suggested Corll perceived her inclusion as a direct threat to the secrecy of the arrangement he had spent years carefully maintaining. Williams, notably, was the first young woman Henley had ever brought into Corll's orbit, and her presence appears to have disrupted, in some fundamental way that investigators have since spent considerable time trying to understand, the specific closed and controlled dynamic that Corll had insisted upon throughout the preceding years of the operation. The gathering that night involved drug and alcohol use among all present, huffing spray paint and drinking, and at some point during the evening, after the group had spent hours together in what began as an apparently ordinary social gathering, Corll produced handcuffs and a firearm, restraining Henley, Curley, and Williams and announcing his intention, according to Henley's subsequent confession, to kill all three of them, a statement that represented, for the first time in Henley's years of involvement with Corll, an explicit and direct threat against Henley's own life rather than simply against the various victims Henley had helped recruit. What followed was a prolonged and increasingly tense negotiation, with Henley attempting to talk Corll down and eventually convincing him to release his own restraints under the pretense of participating in the assault on the other two captives, a manipulation that gave Henley access to Corll's own firearm, a weapon that had, until that specific moment, always represented Corll's own instrument of control over every person present in any given room. In the confrontation that followed, Wayne Henley shot Dean Corll 6 times, killing him in the hallway of the house on Lamar Drive, ending, in a matter of seconds, and through an act of violence turned back against its own architect, an operation that had continued largely unchallenged for nearly 3 years. Rhonda Williams and Timothy Curley, the 2 young people whose presence had triggered Corll's fatal reaction that night, survived the encounter, released from their restraints once Henley had gained control of the situation, becoming, in a case defined overwhelmingly by loss, 2 of the very few people who ever found themselves inside that specific closed circle of violence and lived to describe what they had witnessed. Both would later provide testimony that proved significant in corroborating elements of Henley's own account of the killing, though neither had any prior knowledge of the broader pattern of murders that had been occurring for years before that single chaotic night finally brought the entire operation into the open. Whether Henley's account of the events leading up to the shooting, presented consistently in his subsequent statements to police and in his later trial testimony, represents a complete and accurate description of what occurred that night, or whether it reflects a version of events specifically constructed to minimize his own extensive prior participation in Corll's crimes, has remained a subject of ongoing debate among those who have studied the case closely, given the extensive and voluntary nature of Henley's involvement in recruiting and assisting in the murder of numerous victims across the preceding years. What is not in dispute is what followed. Henley called police, waited calmly for their arrival, and then provided a detailed and extensive confession that, over the following hours and days, led investigators to the boat storage shed where the majority of the victims' remains had been buried, initiating what would become one of the largest and most painstaking body recovery operations in the history of American law enforcement up to that point. The excavation of the boat shed, conducted over several days in the intense August heat of a Houston summer, produced a scene that veteran investigators and medical examiners who participated in the recovery described, even years later, as among the most physically and psychologically demanding experiences of their careers. Bodies were recovered in various states of preservation, many wrapped in plastic sheeting and packed with lime in an apparent effort to accelerate decomposition and control odor, stacked in some areas of the dirt floor nearly on top of one another. a physical arrangement that spoke, in its own grim way, to the sheer scale and duration of what had been occurring, largely unnoticed for nearly 3 years in a rented storage space that neighbors had, for the most part, paid little attention to. Medical examiners and forensic personnel worked in shifts under conditions that several participants later described as almost unbearable. The combination of extreme heat, the physical demands of careful excavation, and the sheer emotional weight of the work taking a toll that several of those involved carried with them for the remainder of their careers. News of the discovery spread rapidly through Houston and then nationally as reporters and camera crews gathered outside the boat shed property, and the scale of what was being uncovered, body after body after body emerging from a single unremarkable storage structure, generated a specific and sustained horror that dominated national news coverage for weeks. At the time of its discovery, the case represented the largest known serial murder investigation in American history by confirmed victim count, a grim distinction that would not be surpassed until later cases, including several covered elsewhere in this series, eventually exceeded it in scale. National news anchors and newspaper reporters who covered the story in 1973 described struggling to find precedent for a case of this magnitude, and the specific horror of children being systematically murdered by a trusted neighborhood adult, aided by 2 of their own peers, generated a level of public shock and grief that extended far beyond Houston itself, prompting national conversations about missing persons reporting, the vulnerability of working-class families to institutional neglect, and the specific and previously under-examined danger posed by predatory adults who deliberately cultivate positions of trust within close-knit communities. Families across the Heights neighborhood who had reported sons missing over the preceding 3 years began arriving at the site and at local police stations, desperate for any information regarding whether their own child might be among the remains being recovered, a period that several surviving family members later described as among the most agonizing of their entire lives. A prolonged limbo of hope and dread that stretched, in some cases across weeks before formal identification, finally provided an answer. The identification process for the recovered remains extended over months and, in several cases, years, complicated by the number of bodies involved, the state of decomposition, and the limited forensic identification technology available in 1973 compared to the DNA-based methods that would become standard practice in later decades. Investigators relied heavily on dental records, distinctive personal effects recovered alongside the remains, and, in several cases, comparison against the specific physical descriptions provided in the missing persons reports that had, for years, been filed and then largely set aside by a department that had never connected them to one another. Several victims recovered from the boat shed and from the additional burial sites eventually identified at High Island Beach and near Lake Sam Rayburn would not be formally identified for years after their initial recovery, and, in at least a small number of cases, formal identification would not occur until decades later. Following advances in forensic DNA technology, similar to those that eventually helped resolve aspects of several other cold cases covered across this series, including the Golden State Killer and Gary Ridgway investigations. David Brooks and Wayne Henley were both arrested and charged in connection with the murders, with the scope of charges against each reflecting the specific and differing accounts of their individual participation that emerged during the extensive investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. Henley was ultimately charged with multiple counts of murder, and following a trial that generated significant national media attention given the scale and horror of the case. A trial during which prosecutors presented extensive testimony regarding Henley's direct role in recruiting and restraining numerous victims. He was convicted in 1974 and sentenced to a total of 594 years in prison, a sentence whose sheer numerical scale reflected the multiple individual counts on which he had been convicted rather than any single specific calculation, and one that left no realistic possibility of parole within his natural lifetime. This original conviction was later overturned on procedural grounds related to how the jury had been selected, and Henley was retried, again convicted, and again sentenced to a similarly extensive term, effectively guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life, regardless of the specific procedural outcome of either trial. David Brooks was convicted separately in connection with his own role in the murders, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment following a trial that, unlike Henley's, resulted in a single sentence rather than a cumulative one, reflecting differences in how the charges against each defendant had been structured by prosecutors based on the specific evidence available regarding each man's individual participation in specific identifiable murders. Brooks maintained, throughout the trial and in the years that followed, a somewhat more limited acknowledgement of his own direct participation compared to Henley's more extensive confession, a distinction that several legal observers who followed the case closely have suggested may reflect genuine differences in the two men's relative roles, or may simply reflect differing legal strategies pursued by their respective defense attorneys given the specific evidence. Prosecutors held against each of them individually. He remained incarcerated in the Texas prison system until his death in 2020, having spent nearly 5 decades behind bars without ever being granted parole, dying of complications related to COVID-19 during the early period of the global pandemic. A death that received relatively limited media attention given the broader scale of the public health crisis occurring at the time. A strangely quiet ending, in the specific context of a case that had once dominated national headlines, for a man who had spent years as a central participant in one of the largest serial murder cases in American history. Wayne Henley remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, having been repeatedly denied parole in the decades since his conviction, and has, at various points in the years since his imprisonment, given interviews to journalists and documentary filmmakers in which he has offered varying and, in the assessment of several researchers who have studied his statements over time, at times inconsistent accounts of his own culpability and the specific circumstances of individual murders, continuing a pattern of partial disclosure and self-serving narrative construction that several criminologists have suggested reflects an ongoing effort to minimize his own responsibility even decades after the crimes themselves occurred. What the Dean Corll case leaves behind, beyond the specific and enormous scale of confirmed victims that made it at the time of its discovery. The largest known serial murder case in American history is a set of deeply uncomfortable and enduring questions regarding both the specific institutional failures that allowed the case to continue for as long as it did, and the broader and more disturbing question of how 2 teenage boys came to actively participate in the systematic murder of their own peers over a period of multiple years. The institutional failure at the center of this case, the systematic dismissal of missing persons, reports involving teenage boys from a working-class Houston neighborhood, treated by police, case after case, as unremarkable instances of teenage runaway behavior rather than as potential evidence of a connected and ongoing pattern of violence, represents one of the clearest and most damning examples, across every case covered in this series, of how specific social and economic biases within law enforcement institutions can directly and materially extend the duration and scope of a serial offender's activity. Had Houston police, at any point during 1970, 1971, or 1972, connected even a handful of the dozens of missing person reports being filed by families across the Heights neighborhood, it is entirely plausible that Corll's operation could have been identified and stopped years before it eventually collapsed through the internal violence of August 1973. A violence that occurred not because of any external law enforcement pressure, but purely as a consequence of tensions within the small, closed circle of people who had known what was happening all along. In the years following the case, several municipal and state-level reforms to missing persons reporting and interagency case coordination were specifically credited, at least in part, to the public outrage generated by the revelation of how many warning signs and unconnected reports had existed for years before the case was finally exposed. The specific dynamic involving Corll's two teenage accomplices remains one of the most psychologically complex and, in the specific context of criminological research, most extensively studied aspects of the entire case, representing a documented instance in which two adolescents initially connected to a predatory adult through ordinary, and in Brooks's case at least, genuinely long-standing childhood friendship, were gradually drawn into direct participation in serial murder through a combination of financial incentive, psychological manipulation, and, according to their own accounts, escalating fear of the consequences of refusal or exposure. Whether this progression reflects a specific and identifiable pattern of grooming and coercion that criminologists have since attempted to study and understand in the context of preventing similar dynamics in other cases, or whether it reflects a more troubling and less easily explained capacity for direct participation in extreme violence on the part of the two young men themselves, remains a subject that researchers studying the case have never fully resolved to consensus, and the case continues to be cited, decades later, in academic literature examining the psychology of adolescent complicity in adult-orchestrated violence. The victims of Dean Corll, David Brooks, and Wayne Henley, whose names deserve to be remembered independently of the institutional indifference that allowed so many of their disappearances to go uninvestigated for years, included boys and young men ranging in age from as young as 13 to their early 20s, the overwhelming majority of them residents of the same working-class Houston Heights neighborhood where Corll had spent years building his reputation as a generous and harmless neighborhood fixture. Among the identified victims were James Glass, 14, Danny Yates, 14, Jerry Waldrop, 13, Randy Harvey, 15, Reuben Watson Haney, 15, Michael Balch, 15, Wally J. Simino, 14, Richard Hembry, 13, Marty Ray Jones, 17, Charles Cobble, 17, Marion Nesmith, 21, Homer Garcia, 15, John Sellers, 17, Billy Balch, 17, William Ray Lawrence, 15. Several of these young men were recruited directly by Henley himself, a fact that adds a specific and painful layer of betrayal to an already devastating case, since these boys trusted Henley precisely because he was their peer, someone their own age whose invitation to a party or a gathering carried none of the wariness that an approach from an adult stranger might have triggered. Two sets of brothers were among the confirmed victims, a detail that meant at least two Heights families lost more than one child to the same operation, a specific and compounded grief that several surviving family members have described, in interviews conducted decades later, as almost impossible to fully articulate even after so many years. 28 confirmed young lives, most of them still legally children, taken over the course of 3 years in a neighborhood where an entire community had, in a devastating and specific sense, been taught to trust the wrong man precisely because of how genuinely generous and likable he had made himself appear to be. The pattern, as it always has been across every case this series has covered, does not belong to the man whose candy factory gave an entire neighborhood a reason to trust him, nor to the two young men who chose, across years and dozens of individual opportunities to refuse or expose what was happening, to continue participating instead. It belongs to the families who filed missing persons report after missing persons report, only to be told, again and again, that their sons had probably just run away. It belongs to the parents who spent years, in some cases decades, not knowing that their child's remains had been sitting, the entire time, beneath the dirt floor of a rented boat shed less than a few miles from their own home. It belongs to the boys who trusted a friend their own age, never suspecting that the invitation to a party carried within it the same danger that a generation of Heights parents had, tragically, and through no fault of their own, been assured did not exist. It belongs to the two sets of brothers whose families lost more than one child to the same operation, a specific and doubled grief that no single family should ever have had to carry. They are the reason a 17-year-old's late-night phone call to a police dispatcher, however strange and however delayed, finally became the moment an entire community learned the truth about what had actually been happening to their missing sons. They are the reason 28 names, and the specific institutional failure that allowed so many of their disappearances to go uninvestigated for years, have never been allowed to simply disappear into the same silence that surrounded them for so long while they were still, desperately, being searched for.